I'm a freelance graphic designer. For most people, that sounds like a dream job. You're your own boss, you work on creative stuff, you set your own hours. But that's a lie. The industry is a meat grinder. There's always someone younger, cheaper, and faster. If you miss a deadline, you don't just get a slap on the wrist. You lose the client, you get a bad review, and you don't make rent. The pressure is constant and crushing. It started with a project for a big tech company. The deadline was impossible, something like 3 full branding concepts in 48 hours. I was panicking. Another designer I knew, he was always getting work, always seemed to be online. I asked him how he did it. He just smiled and gave me 2 little orange pills. He called it the freelancer's little helper. It was Adderall. I took one that night, and it was like a switch flipped in my brain. The noise in my head went silent. There was no anxiety, no procrastination, no fatigue. There was only the work. The cursor on my screen was the only thing in the world. I worked for 16 hours straight, and the ideas were sharp, clean, and better than anything I'd done before. I hit the deadline with hours to spare. The client was blown away. That project landed me a retainer. It was my biggest contract ever. So the Adderall became part of my toolkit, just like my Adobe subscription or my Wacom tablet. I told myself it was for emergencies only, but the emergencies started happening every week, then every day. A 10-milligram pill for a tight deadline became 30 milligrams just to get through a normal workday. I wasn't just using it to survive anymore. I was using it to compete, to get that creative edge. My work had never been better, but I was falling apart. I stopped eating regular meals. My heart was always thumping a little too fast, a low, buzzing drumbeat under my skin. The come-downs were hell. I'd be locked in my own head, staring at a blank screen, feeling completely drained and useless. I couldn't even sketch a doodle without that familiar panic rising in my throat. I knew it was a problem, but stopping felt impossible. Quitting didn't just mean a few bad days of withdrawal. It meant falling behind. It meant losing clients. It meant failing. The drug that I thought was helping my career had become my career. It wasn't a necessary evil anymore. It was just necessary. At this point, my life was just a cycle of deadlines and pills. It wasn't about emergencies anymore. I'd wake up and take one just to face my inbox. My 30-milligram dose turned into a 60-milligram dose. It was simple math. If one pill gave me 16 hours of focus, 2 would give me 32. I could bill for more hours, take on more projects, and get even further ahead. Soon I stopped keeping track. I just had the bottle on my desk, and I'd pop one whenever the fog started to creep back in. I started working through the nights again, not because I had to, but because I could. Sometimes I'd be at my desk for 48 hours straight, fueled by nothing but Adderall and lukewarm coffee. My apartment was a mess of takeout containers and scribbled notes. I didn't care. The work was getting done, and it was brilliant. But I couldn't sleep. Even when I finished a project and my body was screaming for rest, my mind wouldn't shut down. I would lie in bed with my eyes wide open, my heart hammering against my ribs. I'd just stare at the ceiling for hours, my brain still designing, an endless slideshow of fonts and color palettes. That's when the sound started. It was small things at first. I'd hear a faint, high-pitched whine in the dead of night, like an old TV was left on. I'd get up and check, unplugging everything. But the sound would still be there, right at the edge of my hearing. Sometimes I'd hear muffled talking from the apartment next door. It sounded like they were arguing, and I could have sworn I heard them mention my name. I told myself it was just the stress. I was overworked and barely sleeping. It was normal to be on edge, to mishear things. It was the building's pipes, or the traffic outside, or my brain was just playing tricks on me from exhaustion. The easiest way to make it all stop was to just take another pill and get back to work. Then the noise in my head would go quiet again. There was only the work. I was on day 3 of no sleep, working on a new project. It was for some local community center, a flyer for a children's event. The pay was low, but the deadline was immediate, so I took it. I was hunched over my desk, the only light in my apartment coming from the 27-inch monitor. The high-pitched whine I'd been hearing was back, but now it felt like it was coming from inside my own skull. The client sent over a creative brief. There was only one rule, one horrible, non-negotiable rule. All text had to be in Comic Sans. I remember feeling a genuine wave of nausea. Of all the fonts in the world, it had to be that one. It's a joke in the design community, a punchline. Using it felt like admitting defeat, but a paying client is a paying client. So I typed out the headline, Saturday Fun Fair. I stared at the words, feeling my eye twitch. Something was wrong with the letter S. It looked too curvy, too smug. The A in fair looked off too. The loop at the bottom wasn't a clean curve. It looked more like a sneer. I shook my head and rubbed my eyes. I'd been awake for 72 hours. Of course I was seeing things. I just needed to finish the work, get paid, and then maybe I could rest. I went back to typing out the details. The time, the location, the list of activities. And that's when I saw it clearly. In the phrase face painting, the letters shifted. For just a second, the space between the C and the E closed up, and the E twisted itself. It didn't say face, it said fake. I leaned back in my chair, my heart starting to pound that familiar, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I stared at the screen, and the whole font seemed to come alive. It wasn't just in my head anymore. The letters were bloated, like they were full of something rotten. Their round, friendly shapes were a lie. They were leering at me. The muffled voices I'd been hearing from the next apartment suddenly made sense. They weren't coming from next door. They were coming from the screen. They were whispers, embedded in the shapes of the letters, telling me I was a hack, a fraud, a pill popper who was about to lose everything. My hands started shaking. I tried to select the text box to delete it, to change it to anything else, to Helvetica, to Times New Roman, anything. But my mouse cursor started lagging. It dragged across the screen as if it was moving through something thick, like tar. Every time I got close to the text, the cursor would jump away. The font wouldn't let me touch it. I pushed my chair back from the desk, my breathing shallow. On the screen, the jokey, cheerful font glowed in the darkness. It was mocking me. It was sentient. It was an evil, grinning thing that had taken over my project, and it knew all my secrets. It wasn't just a font on a screen anymore. I could feel it in the room with me. I scrambled away from the desk and fell out of my chair. I hit the floor hard, but I barely felt it. All I could see was the glow of the monitor, that damn font smiling at me from across the room. I had to get it out. I crawled over to the wall and ripped the power cord out of the socket. The screen went black, but the room didn't feel empty. I could still feel it there, in the air. I unplugged everything. The monitor, the tower, my external hard drives, even the speakers. I disconnected the Ethernet cable, convinced it was a pipeline for the font to spread. I thought about smashing the computer, just taking a hammer to the whole setup. But I was afraid. I was terrified that if I broke it, the font would be released, like black smoke, and infect everything in my apartment. The whispers were still there, faint, but they were no longer coming from the screen. They were coming from inside my own head. The next few days are a blur. I didn't turn my computer on again. I couldn't. I was certain that the font, this Comic Sans entity, had infected my entire digital life. It was a virus. Every file, every project I'd ever made was compromised. It was all a lie. Just like the font said, I was a fraud, and it had corrupted all my work as proof. My physical portfolio was sitting on my bookshelf, a big black leather book with printouts of my best designs. I pulled it down, my hands still shaking. I had to see if the infection was there too. I spread the pages out on my floor and started looking. Really looking. I wasn't looking at them as a designer anymore. I was looking for messages, for codes. I spent hours, maybe days, hunched on the floor with a ruler and a red pen. I was deciphering them. I measured the spaces between the letters on a poster I'd designed. I drew lines connecting the serifs on a logo. I thought the curves of certain letters were a map. The whispers in my head were guiding me, telling me what to look for, telling me that I was close to figuring it all out. My phone would buzz on the counter, probably clients wondering where I was. I just let it buzz. The work didn't matter anymore. Only the messages mattered. My entire career, my life's work, was spread out on the floor, and I was sure it was all trying to tell me something horrible. The messages weren't making sense. I spent all night on the floor, but the lines I drew with the red pen just looked like a mess. The whispers were getting louder, angrier. They weren't just telling me I was a fraud anymore. They were telling me the contamination was spreading. My work wasn't a map of the infection. It was the infection itself. Every file, every logo, every layout was a carrier for that twisted, smiling font and the evil it held. I stood up. I felt calm. There was only one thing to do. It was a cleansing. I had to purify everything. I walked to my office closet where I kept all my hard drives. My main drive, my backup drives, the archives going back 10 years. I lined them all up on the floor. I went to the kitchen and got the big bottle of bleach from under the sink. The smell was sharp and clean. It felt right. I walked back to the hard drives and unscrewed the cap. I poured the bleach over them, one by one. I made sure it seeped into every port and every seam. I could hear a faint fizzing sound. I imagined it was the sound of the font screaming as the chemicals burned it out of existence. My entire digital career, a decade of work, was sitting in a toxic puddle on my hardwood floor. I felt nothing. It was just a necessary step. But that wasn't enough. The physical portfolio was still on the floor, the printed pages still holding the original poison. I gathered them all up in my arms. The posters, the brochures, the brand guides. I took them into the bathroom and dumped them in the tub. I found a lighter in my junk drawer. I lit one corner of a poster I had won an award for. I watched the flame catch. The glossy paper curled and turned black. The bright colors of my design turned to gray ash. I dropped it in the tub and it lit the other pages. For a moment, the fire lit up the bathroom, and I could see my face in the mirror. My eyes were wide and my face was stained with red ink from the pen. The room filled with thick, black smoke. When the last page was gone, I just stood there in the dark, breathing in the smell of bleach and ash. The whispers were gone. My apartment was completely silent for the first time in weeks. I had done it. I had destroyed the entity. I had burned it all away. In the process, I had also destroyed my entire career. Every file was gone. Every backup was corrupted. Every physical example was a pile of ash in my bathtub. I had nothing left. I don't have delusions anymore. The pills are long gone. I even rebuilt my career slowly from scratch. But the scar is still there. To this day, I can't look at Comic Sans. If I see it on a kid's birthday party invitation or a school bake sale flyer, my heart starts pounding and I feel a cold sweat on my neck. I immediately have to look away. It's not a design choice for me. It's the face of the thing that made me burn my entire world down. It was about 4 a.m, deep inside some warehouse rave on the edge of the city. The bass vibrated up through the concrete floor and into my bones. We'd all taken MDMA hours ago, and for a while it was perfect. That classic feeling of love for everyone and everything under the strobing lights. But now, that warm glow was fading. That familiar, hollow feeling was starting to creep in around the edges. My friends and I were in a little huddle, all of us chasing the same dragon. We weren't just casual users. We were explorers. We thought of ourselves as psychonauts, but really we were just thrill seekers, always looking for a more intense experience, a higher peak. We'd been through the usual party rotation. Molly, ketamine, acid. The magic was still there, but it wasn't new anymore. We knew the map too well. That's when my friend Josh pulled out a small, crinkled plastic bag. Inside was a lumpy, off-white powder. He said a guy he knew called it Ivory Wave. It was a synthetic cathinone, one of the so-called bath salts that were just starting to show up. He said it was like the most euphoric, energetic parts of every other drug combined, but dialed up to 1,000. He told us it was a rocket ship, a straight shot to the peak with no slow climb. We stared at the baggie in his hand. The promise of something new, something that could blast past the ceiling of everything we'd felt before, was too tempting. We were tired of the predictable ride. We wanted to be shot out of a cannon. In my memory, there wasn't even a real discussion. We all just looked at each other and nodded. Stupidity loves company. In the middle of that dark, sweaty room, surrounded by 100 dancing strangers, we decided to try a drug we knew nothing about. We thought we were about to unlock a new level of euphoria. We had no idea we were about to walk off a cliff. The rave ended when the sun came up and the music finally died. My friends were destroyed. They looked pale and exhausted, already talking about the horrible come-down waiting for them. Josh said he felt like he'd been scraped off the floor. But I didn't feel that way. I felt wired, alert. For me, the engine was still running. The party was over for them. But I wasn't ready to get off the ride. I went back to my apartment alone. In the bright morning light, I took the crinkled baggie out of my pocket and dumped the rest of the Ivory Wave onto my coffee table. I chopped up another line and snorted it. It wasn't like that first amazing rush at the rave. The euphoria was gone. This was just raw, jagged energy. A tense, teeth-grinding alertness. It wasn't even fun, but it was better than stopping. I was chasing that first feeling, convinced that if I just took enough, I could get back there. The next few days are a blur. I didn't sleep, I didn't eat. I didn't answer my phone when my friends called to see if I was alive. I just sat in my dark apartment, redosing every hour or so, whenever the terror started to creep in. My body felt like it was breaking down. I was constantly drenched in a cold, sticky sweat. My hands shook so badly, I could barely bring a glass of water to my mouth. I remember catching my reflection in the black screen of my TV and not recognizing the person staring back. His eyes were huge and black. His face was gaunt and pale. He looked terrified. Then the noises started. Not subtle, maybe. I'm just tired noises. These were real. I heard footsteps in the apartment above mine, pacing back and forth for hours. I heard whispering coming from the air vents. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was malicious. I knew they were talking about me. I would stand completely still in the middle of my living room, holding my breath, trying to listen. I became convinced that people from the rave had followed me home. I spent hours peeking through a crack in my blinds, watching the street. Every car that drove by was them, circling my block. Every person walking their dog was a scout. The paranoia was absolute. I shoved my heavy armchair against my front door to barricade myself in. My apartment was supposed to be my fortress, the only safe place left. But then, standing in the silence, I saw a shadow move in the corner of my eye. A quick, dark shape darting from my hallway into the kitchen. They weren't just outside anymore. They were inside the apartment with me. I stood frozen in the middle of my living room for what felt like an hour. I didn't breathe. I just listened. The whispers from the vents had stopped, but the silence was worse. It felt heavy, like the air before a storm. I knew they were in the apartment with me, hiding, waiting. Then I felt a tickle on the back of my neck. I swatted at it, thinking it was just a stray hair or my own sweat. But then I felt it again, on my forearm. A tiny, crawling sensation. I scratched at it, hard. The feeling went away for a second, then came back in a different spot. My ankle, my chest, my scalp. Soon, it was everywhere. It felt like my whole body was alive with an army of tiny insects, crawling just beneath the surface of my skin. A constant, maddening, writhing feeling that I couldn't scratch away. I stripped off my shirt, frantically running my hands over my arms and torso, but there was nothing there. My skin was just slick with cold sweat. I could feel them, though. Thousands of them, marching around inside me. At first, I thought they were just bugs. Mites, maybe. Something that breeds in filth. My apartment was a wreck, and the idea wasn't impossible. But then, a new thought hit me, and it was so clear and so perfect that I knew it was the truth. It wasn't random. The people who had been watching me, the shadows in my apartment, they had done this. They had released them. I looked down at my arm, at a spot that was itching horribly. I stared until my vision blurred. I was sure I could see something. A microscopic black dot burrowing into my skin. It wasn't a bug. It was too precise. It was mechanical. The realization slammed into me. They weren't insects. They were machines. Tiny cybernetic listening devices. That's how they were listening. That's where the whispers were coming from. They weren't in the vents. They were in my head. The bugs weren't biting me. They were implanting themselves into my body, turning my own skin into a surveillance network. A wave of pure terror washed over me. I had to get them out. I started scratching again, but this time it wasn't just to make an itch go away. I was digging. I dug my fingernails into my arms, my neck, my legs, trying to get under the skin and pull them out. I had to get them out before they were all implanted. My fortress hadn't just been breached. I was the fortress, and the enemy was already inside. The scratching wasn't enough. I was just tearing up my skin, and they were still under there. Still crawling, still transmitting. I needed something better. Something that could burn them out. A tool. I remembered my electronics toolkit in the back of my closet. I ran to it and tore it open. dumping the contents all over the floor. Pliers, wire cutters, screwdrivers. Then I saw it. A soldering iron. It was perfect. I was fighting machines with a machine. It made perfect sense. I grabbed it and plugged it into the wall socket in my living room. I set it down on a corner of my coffee table, careful not to burn the wood. I just stood there and watched the metal tip start to glow, a faint orange in the dark room. I could hear a low hum and smell the hot metal dust. This would be clean. This would get them. My arm was still itching, a specific spot right on my forearm. A big one was there. I could feel it pulsing. I picked up the soldering iron. The plastic handle was warm. I took a deep breath. Then I pressed the glowing tip into my skin. There was a loud sizzle, and the smell of burning hair and meat filled the air. The pain was unbelievable, sharp and white-hot. But I pushed through it. I watched the smoke rise from my own arm. I held it there, grinding it in, convinced I had to melt the tiny machine completely. This wasn't pain. This was a cleansing. It was the sound of winning. I pulled the iron away. There was a black, weeping hole in my arm. The skin around it was bright red and blistering. The crawling sensation in that spot was gone. It worked. I had killed one. A wave of relief washed over me. I looked at the rest of my arm, at the red lines and scratches. They were everywhere. I had to get all of them. I started again, finding another spot on my bicep that felt like it was writhing. I pressed the hot iron down, and again on my shoulder, the room filled with smoke. I just kept going, burning out the transmitters, one by one. I don't know how long I was at it. An hour, maybe 2. The next thing I remember is the sound of a key in the front door and then my roommate walking in. He stopped dead in the doorway of the living room, a bag of groceries still in his hand. His face just went white. He said my name. Then he said it again, but this time he was yelling. The room was full of smoke, and the smell of hot metal and burned meat was overwhelming. I was standing in the middle of the room, shirtless, holding the soldering iron. I tried to explain to him what I was doing, that I was getting them out, the transmitters. He just shook his head, his eyes wide with horror. Everything after that is in pieces. I remember him on the phone, screaming, "He's burning himself," into the receiver. I remember dropping the iron and the sound it made when it hit the floor. I vaguely remember paramedics. I remember them trying to touch my arms and me fighting back, screaming that they couldn't touch them, that the bugs would get on them too. The pain, which had been a distant signal, suddenly roared to life. Then it was just black. I woke up in a hospital bed. Both of my arms were heavily bandaged and strapped to the railings. A tired-looking doctor came in and told me that I was on an involuntary psychiatric hold. He told me I had experienced severe stimulant-induced psychosis. He said the crawling feeling was a hallucination. The delusion was gone. Just like that. The whispers were gone. The watchers were gone. The bugs were gone. All that was left was the reality. I had torn my own skin apart and burned myself over and over for no reason. The terror I felt in my psychosis was nothing compared to the cold shame I felt in that hospital bed. The burns healed, but they left scars. Ugly silver patches of tissue cover my arms and my left shoulder. People stare sometimes. They think they're track marks or a bad tattoo. I never tell them the truth. I just say it was an accident. They are a permanent map of a night where I was a prisoner inside my own mind, trying to dig an enemy out of my skin that was never there to begin with. I was a stay-at-home mom to 2 kids under 5. That was my whole world. And I was drowning in it. The days were just a blur of diapers, screaming, spilled juice, and endless piles of laundry. My husband worked long hours. By the time he got home, I was so exhausted I could barely form a sentence. The house was always a disaster. I felt like a failure, constantly behind, constantly on the verge of falling apart. I loved my kids more than anything, but I was living in a state of permanent, bone-deep exhaustion. I started spending my nights, after everyone was asleep, just scrolling on my phone. Not for fun, but for answers. I would type things like, "No energy stay-at-home mom," or "How to cope with being tired all the time," into search bars. I ended up on some old forum in a thread from years ago. A woman described the same life I was living. The same exhaustion, the same feeling of failing. And she mentioned her secret, propylhexedrine. She said she got it from Benzodrex nasal inhalers, right off the shelf at any pharmacy. The next day, I went to Walgreens to pick up a prescription for my son's ear infection. While I was waiting, I walked to the cold and flu aisle. And there they were, Benzodrex inhalers, in a little blue and white box. It felt so normal, so harmless. I bought 3 of them, along with some Tylenol and a bottle of water. I felt a small flicker of shame, like the pharmacist could tell what I was going to do. But she just scanned them and put them in the bag. Back home, I waited until the kids were down for their afternoon nap. I locked myself in the bathroom and my hands were shaking a little as I followed the instructions I'd memorized from the forum. I cracked open the plastic tube and pulled out the little cotton rod soaked in chemicals. I dropped it into a bottle of lemon juice and just let it sit. The whole thing felt so ridiculous, like a sad science experiment. About half an hour later, I drank the sour, horrible-tasting liquid. Then I went downstairs to face the mountain of dishes in the sink. I didn't expect much. But then, it started. It wasn't a euphoric, floaty high. It was like someone had flipped a massive power switch inside my body. The exhaustion just vanished. The fog in my brain dissolved. I had energy. Not just normal energy, but a clean, focused, limitless supply of it. I scrubbed every dish until they shined. I sorted and washed 3 loads of laundry. I vacuumed the entire house, even moving the furniture. When the kids woke up, I wasn't the tired, irritable mom they were used to. I was fun mom. We played on the floor for hours. I didn't feel a single ounce of fatigue. I had found it, the perfect solution. It was cheap, it was legal, and I could hide it in plain sight. I thought I had found a magic key that would finally make me the mother I was always supposed to be. That one magic key quickly became a daily necessity. It was my morning coffee, but so much better. I'd wake up before my husband and the kids, go to the bathroom, and drink my little potion. By the time the first cry came from the nursery, the energy would be surging through me. The house was spotless. The laundry was never ending, but I was always on top of it. I was super mom. The exhaustion was gone, and in its place was this limitless buzzing power. But soon, 1 cotton rod wasn't enough. The magic started to fade. I'd drink the lemon juice and feel the energy come on, but it was muddy, not as sharp. The answer was simple. If 1 works, 2 will work better. I started soaking 2 cottons, then 3. I'd buy the inhalers in handfuls from different pharmacies so no one would get suspicious. It was easy. I was just a tired mom with a cold. No one ever looked twice. The problem was, the power switch didn't have an off position anymore. I'd put the kids to bed, my husband would fall asleep, and I'd lie there in the dark, my eyes wide open. My body was screaming for rest, but my mind was doing laps. I'd just stare at the ceiling, my heart thumping a fast, steady rhythm against my ribs for hours. Sometimes I wouldn't sleep at all. I'd just get up when I heard the birds chirping and start the whole process over again. A weird sense of detachment started to set in. I was going through the motions. I was playing with my kids, reading them stories, making them dinner. But it felt like I was watching it all happen from somewhere else, from behind my own eyes. I was an actress playing the part of a happy, energetic mother. My husband would come home and be amazed. "You're a machine," he'd say, hugging me. I would just smile and feel a jolt of fear. He had no idea I hadn't slept in 48 hours. He couldn't see how badly my hands were shaking. I started getting paranoid that he knew, that his comments weren't compliments, they were tests. I'd watch him from the corner of my eye, analyzing the way he looked at me. Every question felt like an accusation. The house was no longer a home. It was a stage, and I had to play my part perfectly, or else he'd find out what a complete fraud I was. The secret was getting heavier, and I felt like I was carrying it all alone in my clean, perfect house. I was on my third day of no sleep when my husband came home from work. The house was spotless, dinner was on the stove, but the buzzing energy was gone. I just felt brittle, like I could shatter. He walked into the kitchen and smiled at me. "Smells great in here," he said. But his voice sounded wrong. It was a little too deep, a little too smooth, like a bad actor reading a line. I looked at his face. It was my husband's face, but the eyes weren't right. They were like glass. There was nothing behind them. He came over to kiss me, and I turned my head at the last second, so he just kissed my cheek. He looked at me, confused. I just stared back, trying to see past the mask he was wearing. That's not him. The thought was so loud and clear, it felt like someone had shouted it in my ear. My son, my 4-year-old, ran into the kitchen then, laughing. He hugged my leg, shouting, "Mommy, Mommy." But his laugh sounded like a recording, a little audio loop playing over and over. I looked down at the top of his head, at his messy brown hair. It was the right hair, the right height, the right little Gap t-shirt. But I felt nothing. Just a cold, horrible wave of terror. This thing holding onto my leg wasn't my son. I took a step back, and he almost fell. I didn't reach out to catch him. I just stared. My husband, or the thing that looked like my husband, took a step towards me. "Are you okay? You look pale." The concern in his voice sounded faked. It was a script. He was testing me, trying to see if I had figured it out. I didn't answer. I just backed away, out of the kitchen and into the living room. They were both watching me, the man with my husband's face and the little boy with my son's laugh. They weren't my family. They were strangers. They had replaced my family somehow, and now I was trapped in my own house with them. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. They looked exactly like the people I loved. But I knew, with a certainty that was absolute, that they were dangerous. I backed away from them, moving slowly towards the back of the house. They didn't follow at first. They just stood there, watching me. The man wearing my husband's face had a look of confusion. The little boy started to cry, his face crumpling in that familiar way. But the sound wasn't right. It was a thin, high-pitched wail that scraped at the inside of my skull. It was the sound of a thing pretending to be sad. He took a wobbly step towards me, his arms reaching out. "Mommy?" The word hit me like a stone. It was a mimic, a lure. It wanted me to come closer. I had to get it out of my house. I had to protect myself. The man took a step forward too, saying my name in that fake, smooth voice. I turned and ran. I fumbled with the lock on the back door, the one that led to the patio. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely turn the deadbolt. I wrenched the door open. The little boy had followed me, still crying that awful, piercing sound. He was right at my heels. I spun around, grabbed his little shoulders, and just pushed him out into the darkness of the backyard. I slammed the door shut before he even hit the ground. The sound of the deadbolt clicking into place was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. I pressed my back against the door, my chest heaving, trying to breathe. For a second, there was silence. Then, a small hand started banging on the glass of the door. The crying turned into a scream. It was the scream of something furious, something that had been caught. My own scream was trapped in my throat. I stumbled into the kitchen and grabbed the phone off the wall mount. My fingers were numb and useless, but I managed to dial 911. The operator's voice was a calm drone on the other end, but I just shouted over her. "There's something trying to get into my house," I gasped, my eyes locked on the little silhouette banging on the back door. "It's trying to break in. Please, you have to help me. It looks like a child, but it isn't. It's an imposter." I remember the red and blue lights painting the walls of my living room. I felt a wave of relief, so strong my knees almost buckled. They were here. I had done the right thing. I ran to the front door and pulled it open, ready to explain everything, to tell them about the imposters, about the things wearing my family's skin. 2 officers stood on my porch. I started talking, the words spilling out of me. I pointed to the back door, trying to explain about the thing pretending to be my son. They just looked at me. Their faces were blank. One of them walked right past me into the house. He went to the back door, unlocked it, and stepped outside. A moment later, he came back in, carrying my 4-year-old in his arms. My husband arrived then, his car screeching into the driveway. That's when it all broke. The illusion just shattered like glass. The officer was holding my son, my real son. He was sobbing, his face buried in the officer's shoulder. He wasn't a monster. He was a terrified little boy whose mother had just thrown him out of his own house. And the man running towards me, his face pale and full of terror, wasn't a stranger. It was my husband. The psychosis evaporated in an instant, and all that was left was the cold, sickening reality. I didn't scream. I just slid down the wall onto the floor. They took me to the hospital, not him. I was placed on an involuntary psychiatric hold. The next day, a woman from Child Protective Services came to my room. She was polite, professional, and her questions felt like daggers. She spoke about a safety plan. She used words like endangerment. I had to face the very real possibility that my actions had cost me my own children. I had become the danger I thought I was protecting them from. We got through it. My husband somehow found a way to stand by me. The CPS case was eventually closed, but the damage is profound. My husband tries not to show it, but I see it sometimes. A flicker of doubt in his eyes when I'm tired or stressed. And the memory of my son's small hands banging on the glass of the back door. That will never leave me. I was the loving mother who read him bedtime stories. But I was also the monster who locked him out in the dark. Both of those things are true. And my family has to live with that person. We all do. I'm a cellist for my entire life. That's what I've been. It's not just a job. It's the only thing that makes any sense. I've spent 20 years with that piece of wood and gut between my knees, chasing a perfect sound. And I was close to getting everything I ever wanted. I had an audition scheduled with the City Symphony, not for a substitute spot, but for a full chair. This was the one, the audition that could change my entire life. But something was wrong. The music wasn't there anymore. I'd sit down to practice, a piece I could normally play in my sleep, and my hands would just lock up. The notes would feel foreign, like I was trying to read a language I'd forgotten. A cold sweat would start on my neck. My heart would start that fast, shallow beat that I remembered all too well. The cello, my oldest friend, felt like a stranger in my hands. The resonance was gone. Instead of singing, the strings just made a dead, wooden sound under my bow. The worst part was, I knew exactly why it was happening. I was clean. It had been 2 years since I'd touched methamphetamine. Back then, there was no anxiety. There was no creative block. I would get spun and I could play for 12 hours straight without a single mistake. The meth burned away the fear, the doubt, everything. All that was left was the music, and it was perfect. I quit because it was killing me, because I had lost everything else. I went through the withdrawal, the therapy, all of it. I thought I had beaten it, but now, with the audition 2 weeks away, the silence in my practice room was deafening. The panic was a physical thing, a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I'd try to play a simple scale and my fingers would shake so badly the notes would come out trembling and weak. I was a professional musician who couldn't play. I had gotten clean to save my life, but I was starting to realize, with a cold, sinking horror, that I might have killed my talent in the process, and I didn't know who I was without it. The audition crept closer. Every day that passed, the weight got heavier. I would sit for hours with the cello, just staring at it. I was so afraid to even try anymore. Every failed attempt, every shaky note, was just more proof that the music was gone, that I was gone. My entire future was tied to a 15-minute performance that I knew, with absolute certainty, I was going to fail. The panic was constant. And in the middle of that panic, the old thought came back. It wasn't a temptation this time. It felt like a solution. I didn't remember the paranoia or the sickness. I remembered the confidence. I remembered my hands moving on the fingerboard, fast and flawless. I remembered the sound, a rich, perfect tone that I could no longer produce. It wasn't the memory of a drug addict. It was the memory of a master cellist. My addicted brain started making its case, and it was a good one. This wasn't about getting high. It wasn't a relapse. This was a strategic move, a tool. Professional athletes take cortisone shots to play through an injury, right? This was the same thing. I would use it just once. I would get spun for the audition, walk in there, and play the performance of my life. Once I had the chair, once my career was secure, I wouldn't need it anymore. I was stronger now. I had been clean for 2 years. Of course, I could control it for one single event. It was a lie, but it was a beautiful, perfect lie. I picked up my phone. My hands were steady for the first time in weeks. I still had the number for my old dealer memorized. I told myself it was just muscle memory. I found his name in my contacts, a name I had sworn I would never type again, and I sent the text. "You around?" The moment I hit send, a part of me felt horrible shame, but a much larger part of me felt something else. Relief? The transaction was fast and dirty, just like always. We met in a parking lot. No words exchanged that weren't necessary. He passed me a small, crumpled baggie, and I handed him the cash. For a second, Holding that little bag, the old shame washed over me. But it disappeared almost instantly, replaced by a surge of purpose. This was a mission. This was for the music. Back in my apartment, I didn't hesitate. I locked the door, went straight to my coffee table, and dumped a shard out. I told myself it was a measured dose, a clinical amount, just enough to get me through the audition. I crushed it and snorted the line. The chemical burn in my nose was horribly familiar, and then the rush hit me. It was like a switch being flipped. The anxiety, the fear, the creative block. It was all just gone. I felt powerful. I felt clear. I picked up my cello. It felt perfect in my hands again, an extension of my own body. I sat down, took a deep breath, and started to play a Bach suite. The notes came out clean, fast, and flawless. My fingers flew across the fingerboard exactly as they were supposed to. It was working. The relief was so intense, I almost started crying. This was me. This was who I was. I had found myself again. I played for hours, and it was perfect. But then, as the sun started to go down, something shifted. I was in the middle of a passage, and a note came out wrong. It was sour, discordant. It scraped against my ear. I stopped, shook my head. My hand must have slipped. I started the passage again. This time, a whole phrase was wrong. The notes were twisted, ugly. They sounded like a taunt. I thought to myself, maybe the dose is wearing off. I just need more to keep the clarity. So I did another line, a bigger one this time. I picked up the bow again, my heart starting to pound. I played the same passage. It was worse. The music was laughing at me. The beautiful, complex harmony of Bach had become a broken, mocking nursery rhyme. The cello wasn't singing anymore. It was screaming. I didn't sleep that night. I just kept going back and forth between the coffee table and the cello. Every line I did just made the music more monstrous. It wasn't just noise anymore. I started hearing things inside the notes. Whispers. A chorus of voices telling me I was a fraud, that I was pathetic for thinking I could ever be great. The cello itself felt like it was judging me, its wood vibrating with a low, malicious hum. The tool I brought in to save my music was now turning it into my own personal hell, and I couldn't stop. I don't remember how I got to the concert hall. I don't remember getting dressed in my suit. The next thing I knew, I was standing backstage, the wood of my grandfather's cello cool against my sweating palm. The stage manager called my name. My legs moved on their own, carrying me out into the blinding white light. The hall was empty except for the 3 judges. They sat behind a long table in the dark, their faces just pale ovals. The silence was huge. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. I sat down on the chair they had placed for me, adjusted the end pin, and positioned the cello. For a second, everything felt normal. This was what I did. I was a musician. I raised my bow, took a breath, and started to play. The first few notes of the Elgar Concerto came out, and they sounded strong, clear. I thought, maybe I can do this. Maybe it worked. Then I heard the whispers. They weren't in the music anymore. They were coming from the judges' table. At first, it was faint. He's a fraud. I glanced up. The middle judge, an older woman with severe-looking glasses, was staring at me. Her face seemed to ripple, just for a second. I kept playing, my fingers starting to feel clumsy and thick. The whispering got louder. Worthless. He's using a crutch. I looked up again, and their faces were no longer human. Their eyes were black, oily pits. The woman's smile stretched impossibly wide, her teeth long and yellow. The man next to her, his skin started to look like it was melting, dripping from his cheekbones like hot wax. They weren't judging my music. They were judging my soul. They knew what I had done. They knew I was a cheat. The notes coming from my cello were monstrous. It wasn't music. It was a screeching, ugly noise that scraped at the inside of my skull. It was the sound of my own fraudulence made real. I couldn't breathe. The demonic, melting faces, the whispers screaming that I was pathetic, the horrible sound from my own instrument. It all closed in on me. I let out a scream, a raw, tearing sound that echoed in the huge, empty hall. It wasn't a human sound. I stood up, kicking the chair away. I lifted the cello, my grandfather's cello, the one he had played for 50 years, high over my head. I brought it down on the edge of the stage. There was a sound I will never forget. Not a musical sound, but a dead, final crack of splintering wood. The whole body of the instrument shattered. The strings snapped with a sound like gunshots. It just fell apart in my hands. I dropped what was left of it. I didn't look at the judges. I didn't see their faces anymore. I just turned and ran. I ran off the stage, out the back door, and into the cold, gray light of the city. I don't know how long I ran. The next thing I remember is sitting on a bench in some park I didn't recognize, the sun too bright in my eyes. The city was loud around me, but my head was silent, completely silent. The whispers were gone. The melting faces were gone. The only hallucination left was the memory of what I had just done. It played over and over in my head, like a film. The scream, the beautiful curved wood of the cello coming down on the hard edge of the stage. Then the sound came back to me. That horrible dead crack. It wasn't just the sound of a broken instrument. It was the sound of my life breaking. That cello had belonged to my grandfather. He taught me my first notes on it. He gave it to me when he got too old to play, and he told me to make it sing for him. I could still feel the phantom weight of it in my hands, the way the wood splintered and gave way. I hadn't just destroyed a rare instrument. I had destroyed a memory. I had smashed the last physical piece of him I had left. I had told myself it was a strategic move, a tool to get my career back. I thought I could control it, use it just once to secure my dream. It was a perfect, clean lie. The relapse hadn't just cost me my sobriety, it had cost me everything. In one single psychotic moment, I had destroyed my one chance at the symphony, my reputation, and an irreplaceable piece of my family. I sat there on that bench for hours, a musician with no instrument and no music left inside him. The meth hadn't brought the music back. It had just made the silence permanent. I never bought another cello. I couldn't. I sold the splintered pieces to a luthier who wanted to salvage the wood. He gave me $200 for it. I used the money to buy a bus ticket back to my hometown. The silence is the real trick of it, the final bill that comes due. It's what's left after the drug has finished with you. Each of these stories starts with a promise. For the graphic designer, it was the promise of a creative edge that never dulled. For the mother, it was the promise of limitless energy to be perfect. For the cellist, it was the promise of his talent back. It always begins as a simple transaction, a deal made in a moment of desperation to fix a problem that feels impossible. But the drug is a liar. The focus it offers isn't a gift. It's a cage. It walls you off from everything else until the only thing left in the world is the deadline, the paranoia, or the crawling sensation under your skin. The energy it provides isn't real. It's just a loan taken out against your own sanity, and the interest rate is psychosis. It's the moment your own mind becomes the enemy, turning a font into a mocking demon, or your own child's face into the mask of a monster. It's the part of your brain that convinces you the only way to get the bugs out is to burn them out yourself. The crash is inevitable. When you finally wake up from it, on a park bench, in a hospital bed, or in a house full of smoke and the smell of bleach, you realize the drug didn't solve the problem you had. It became the only problem you have. You don't just destroy the portfolio, or the cello, or the trust of your family. You destroy the very thing you were trying to save. The silence that follows isn't peace. It's a crater. And you can spend the rest of your life trying and failing to climb out of it.